Thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome.
Genesis 26, God's promise to Isaac. This has been confusing for me because the last chapter left off with the birth of Jacob and Esau and then the birthright stew situation. And now we're like jumping back into the story of Isaac. It could be chronological. It could not be. I really had a hard time deciphering that. What do you guys think?
I could go either way on it. Honestly, it does feel like something that would be earlier in the story, but that's partly because Isaac and Abraham's stories line up so well. Genesis chapter 26 starts with there being a famine in the land and Isaac thinking he's going to go to Egypt, and God says, don't go to Egypt. So you feel like that would be something that would happen earlier on in his story, but at this point, if we take it as chronological that the end of 25 happened first and now we're going into 26, he has adult sons. Like, they're fairly old at this point, not married, but fairly old. And so it does feel like it's a break in the story. If it's not chronological, then it's weird that the chapters would be laid out that way. But really, I could go either way with it. It could be chronological that 25 does come before 26. But there is some precedent for there being a little bit of a change in timeline, because this actually does happen in the first few chapters of Genesis. Genesis 1 gives you the overview of all of the days of creation, and then Genesis chapter 2 breaks down the final day of creation, going back in time a little bit, and shows you what happens with Adam and Eve. So it wouldn't be the only time in Genesis that there's a little bit of a jumping around of the timeline.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you. This is one of those things that people highly claim the document hypothesis, or JEDP, the multiple authors of Genesis. I don't see the support there, and if there was editors in this, I don't think there would be all this jumping around in the middle of the book. For me, I think it just highlights this. So this is the only chapter that solely focuses on Isaac, and it's sandwiched in between two chapters, or at the end of 25 and 27 are highly to do with Jacob claiming the inheritance. So this is like sole focus on Isaac, and I think it's more about presenting him as the patriarchal head after Abraham, solidifying him as God's chosen before the story continues on, is more what it's focused on than needing to be chronological or not chronological.
So this term, is it chiastic sandwich?
Yeah. So a chiasm is seen a lot in poetry. It is a form of reiterating certain ideas. So you'll have a ABA format. So in this instance, you have Jacob, Isaac, Jacob. It jumps back and forth. I think that throughout Genesis is these like chiasms throughout Genesis. And we talked a little bit about that and why there is this heavy emphasis on Genesis being poetic and not actual history, but it just goes to show just how intricate the Bible is.
What did you mean when you put the note on the motif of the serpent?
So one of the things reading through this story and knowing 27 is that the 25 ends with Esau trading his birthright for a very tangible earthly desire, needing food. Then you jump into Isaac here in 26, where it starts out in famine. So he's having this issue of not knowing where food's coming from. We directly came from Esau, just needed to have a meal, so much so that he traded away his birthright. But Isaac is faithful in listening to God, and why I think this shows the transition to him being the spiritual patriarch, the spiritual chosen of the covenantal agreement, the Abrahamic covenant here is focused on. And then later you see a similar stew pop up for Jacob again, that chiastic approach of satisfying a earthly desire or want versus the spiritual focus.
I think it's also really interesting. You bring up, like, Genesis is not written with chapters and verses originally. Those were added in later. And we tend to separate the themes and ideas based on the chapters and verses. But if you take that out, we're literally coming from Jacob and Esau giving up his birthright, the right for his line to produce the savior of mankind, effectively, for a bowl of soup. And Jacob doesn't do that. Jacob is the one who seeks the birthright and surrenders something physical for something spiritual. Isaac, now immediately going from that story to him, does the same thing that Jacob does, because God tells him to. He says, don't go to Egypt. Don't do what your father did. Stay here. Even though things are scarce, I will provide for you. And so he obeys the Lord. He gives up physical security, going to a land he knows would be plentiful and bountiful and providing for his family, like his father did, for something spiritual, for the commands of God. It seems like it's sandwiching these two men on either side of Esau. It's showing that Jacob is the righteous person, doing what he should be doing. And Esau, though Isaac eventually favors him, or rather he does favor him and wants to give him the blessing, he's not like Isaac. So it's interesting reading it that way. I hadn't really given that much thought. It's interesting.
No, it gives it more divinely inspired thumbprint of God in it, because usually Jacob is taught as like deceitful and what he does is deceitful. And I don't want to get away from that because he clearly lies in scripture to get ahead. But you also see the punishment of that play out with him directly fleeing Esau after all of this happened. But the structure of Genesis here, to me, it always, I almost wish, like you said, there wasn't the chapters and verses breaking all of this up, because some of these points I think you miss just because the structure and format that we have currently. And ancient readers would have been directly connected to a lot of these ideas, and why we push original language so much and why we're trying to learn it to the best of our abilities currently, of wordplay and phrases that connect the original audience back to these other older stories. To me, the birthright and the blessing, like being given away for a tangible physical thing, a earthly desire, connects very much to the serpent in the garden. It looked like a good fruit to eat, and it played into our human desire of wanting to be like God or taking matters into our own hands. But that is not the spiritual fulfillment that we should be pursuing. And I liked the Philippians verse that kind of points us away from focusing on the here and now and getting over some of our earthly needs. It says, their destiny is destruction, their God is their stomach, and their glory is in their shame. Their mind is set on earthly things. And that's Philippians 3:19.
Do you think that's drawing a little bit of a parallel intentionally with Esau?
Potentially. The context there, I don't know if it's specifically pulling that, but it's really hard to know what Paul was, his original intent, his audience would have known and picked up at that time. So to me, it fit very perfectly for this, but I don't know if that's true original intent. But
it does fit well, yeah.
But the idea, I think what scripture here is saying is stop focusing on the earthly and look for the divinely inspired spiritual covenant and fulfillment and blessing.
All right. So Cody, on this outline, you've got a little section seeing double here. And when we were eating at dinner, we were talking about this, how surprising it is how similar Isaac and Abraham's story is specifically at this juncture.
Yeah. If you're reading this along with us, you might have picked up that this seems eerily familiar, and there's major deja vu with something we just read. I believe it was Genesis 23, where Abraham meets Abimelech. And now Isaac is meeting Abimelech, and he goes through the whole rigmarole of Rebecca is my sister. That sounds familiar.
This again?
Who did that? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Yeah, and we'll get more into the individual nitty-gritty details of that in a little bit. But real quick, you did write down a series of shared details between Abraham and Isaac's stories. Do we want to read those off real quick?
Yeah, so it's Genesis 20, not 23. So that they're both sojourners in Gerar. You have the first verse of 20 and the first verse of 26. You have the meeting of the king, again, right there in the first verse. You have the lying about the wives, Sarah and Rebecca being sisters. Their excuse for doing this is fear of being killed. one of the ways that it departs, okay, the first time we covered it, Abimelech finds out because God meets him in a dream and tells him that Sarah is not Abraham's sister. This time it's maybe Abimelech's wiser to it, but he sees Rebecca laughing and realizes that it's much more than brother and sisterly love.
We'll get into that.
Then you get the rebukes from Abimelech. Why would you do this to me? The prosperity of the patriarch. You have Abimelech in the story with Abraham giving him possessions. Isaac doesn't get that in this one, but directly following it, you see a blessing from God for material possessions following Isaac's story. Then another weird dispute over wells. Both Isaac and Abraham did that. And then a covenant of peace between Abimelech and Isaac.
Yeah, so a lot of shared details. And I have heard skeptics point to that and claim, see, that's just the same story copied twice. Like clearly there was some kind of error or some issue in transmission of the story over time. And so all of Abraham's stuff got put onto Isaac.
It couldn't possibly be that they're just similar.
I think there's a reason why the Bible lays the story out in such a similar fashion. I think that not just in Genesis, but throughout much of the Bible, especially in Judges, you start to see shared patterns. You start to see this constant cycle of people doing the same stupid things over and over again. Also that in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. How often do you see kings, even the righteous kings in Judah? It repeatedly says, but they did not take down the high places. They did not stop fully the worship of idols or the worship of false gods. That people stumbling in exactly the same way. And I think that's what this chapter is largely focused on. The tendency for us to make the same mistakes, and also for the mistakes of our parents to be transmitted to us. The bad decision-making policies of our parents can affect us.
What is the phrase? The generational curses. Is this a generational curse?
I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a generational curse. Also, it doesn't happen to Jacob and Esau in the same way.
I think generational curse is too victimizing of a word. Like, I much prefer the term generational patterns.
Yes.
Because it's a choice to say, my wife is my sister. It's a choice to drink too much alcohol every single day. Like, you see patterns generationally. In my family, an example would be alcoholism or unwed mothers having babies before they get married, or even not even getting married. So like those are patterns generationally that go back hundreds of years in my biological family. That doesn't mean that I am cursed or that my children are cursed to have the same pattern repeat. We can break cycles, but it's a pattern that we're seeing repeated. Now, it's interesting to me because Abimelech does call Isaac, the blessed of the Lord. You are now something.
Eventually, yes, he does.
So there are marks on them that are also generational blessing, but it's a pattern. It's not a curse because it's a choice.
Yes, I think you're right, Gina. There are good and bad patterns that our parents pass on to us. I'm a lot more like my mom. I tend to be very analytical of my feelings and of the things happening in the world around me. My dad's not so much like that, which isn't to say he's stupid. He's actually incredibly smart, but he thinks very linearly. And he doesn't tend to analyze his feelings so much as the things that he's doing. And if he is analyzing his feelings, he analyzes them in a very linear way, which is very alien to me. It was very difficult working with him the first couple years that I was working under him. But yeah, we tend to gravitate, just like in the story of Jacob and Esau, each one of them inclined towards one of their parents and became a lot like them as a result. Rebecca seems to be fairly conniving and intelligent herself, and that seems to be what Jacob picks up on. Whereas Isaac seems to be much more simple and direct, and that seems to be the thing that Esau picks up on. So good and bad can be transmitted to your children. And I think there are a lot of parents who become very neurotic with their first few children. I don't want to do anything wrong. I don't want to pass on dumb decisions or bad lessons to my kids, but it happens. And you're also right, Gina, and that's not a curse. You're not stuck with that. God has given us agency. We can recognize the things that are good and fight against the things that are bad. But it doesn't change the fact that it's important what we do to our children.
Yes. And the techniques that we employ to raise our children give us the empowerment that is needed to end those generational issues. So like my daughter, Madeline, is 14. And one of the common topics at school right now is drugs and alcohol. And it's not because the kids in her school are using drugs and alcohol. It's just they're discussing it. It's just a common thing that the teenagers are talking about. And some of the kids in the class said, I will never touch alcohol because I've seen what it did to so-and-so in my family. I will never touch pornography because I saw what it did to my parents' marriage. These are things that 14-year-olds are discussing, and rightfully so, because they're making the right judgment. And they're having open conversations with their parents about the cause and effect of those decisions. And it's giving them the wisdom to carry on differently. I think that's what's missing generationally sometimes, is the willingness to have vulnerable, open conversations about difficult things that are causing generational issues in families. Yeah.
All right. So going into this story bit by bit, starting at the beginning. At the start of chapter 26, like we said, there's the famine in the land, and Isaac is going to go to Egypt, but God appears to him and says, don't go down to Egypt. It's interesting here that God spares Isaac from making the same mistake Abraham did. And it seems like this is an instance where both Abraham and Isaac should have known better. This is the land that was promised them. This should be where they are. And Abraham was even told that his descendants would go to Egypt, he would not. But Isaac seems to be making a mistake, and again, reasonably, like all things as they are, taking away God's word for a moment, if you're in a land that has famine and you've got tons of flocks and herds and people looking to you, it makes sense that you would leave and look for better places. And he probably knew that Egypt was a very fertile land. It has the Nile. It probably has a lot of good arable land for him and his flocks. But that's not what he's supposed to do. God told him that this is his land. And so God thankfully spares him of making the same mistake that his father did.
But God goes on to make the Abrahamic covenant with Isaac. It's interesting to me here. Let me read the verses. And the Lord appeared to him and said in verse 2, do not go down to Egypt, dwell in the land of which I shall tell you, sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. It's interesting because I'm sure Isaac grew up, he had to have grown up knowing what was said about his birth and how God had made a covenantal agreement, and how when Isaac was old enough to understand what was happening, his father attempted to sacrifice him. So he had to have understood that there was a very unique promise and agreement over his life with Abraham and God and Isaac. So here, God is reaffirming that directly to Isaac, not just through the father. So that to me is meaningful, but also, is God repeating himself for the sake of repeating himself? Or like, why now is he suddenly announcing this after Isaac has already had children and all of that, presumably?
I don't know how many interactions Isaac has had with God up to this point. I don't think very many.
Just in Jewish tradition, when you have the Akedah, there is this idea that Isaac understands that he is a living sacrifice and he prays to be worthy, seen as worthy. Yeah,
like it seems that the time that he had an interaction with God was with his father during the Akedah. And what I think is interesting is later in this story, Abimelech says, you are now the blessed one of God. Why now?
Cody had an idea earlier that we talked about briefly, because I asked the question, so for verses 4 and 5, where it talks about, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws, does this mean that God would not have sent the Messiah if Abraham had not obeyed? And Cody had this idea of swearing loyalty to God. So it's not just like faith that God exists. It's a loyalty to God through this obedience. And it's a very active form of faith, as opposed to just, oh yeah, God is real and he did the things.
I think people skim over like the alternate meanings, and this pops up in the New Testament more, of pistis. The faith is what pistis is translated to. And usually people hear faith and just believe that it is
Santa Claus.
blind. Yeah, Santa Claus is real. Like blind faith, not faith with action. Like Paul talks about having a faith that is founded in the blood of Christ. That is a real, tangible activity or action that happened, that Christ is the author and perfecter of our faith. Like it started with that for Christians, and that was a tangible physical thing. It wasn't this blind idea of faith. It was, okay, God did this for me. Jesus died on the cross for me. That demands a response, and that response is pledging your allegiance, your loyalty, having that faith of the commander over their army. And I think that's, Abraham doesn't get enough credit for that type of faith. He was the patriarch, the father of faith, but that is also the faith that James describes as it is dead faith if there's no action behind it.
And at some point, Isaac needed to make his faith his own. When he was younger, he shared his father's faith, and his father's faith was substantial. Like you said, Cody, he is an exemplar of the faith. But then the torch was passed on to Isaac. And yes, Isaac did have experiences with God, no doubt. And he was nearly sacrificed to God. Like he did know God existed. And yet the experience that he had with God was through his father, on behalf of his father. His experience here, and also I would say his testing here, is now him and God, not through his father. And so I do think that in many ways, Abimelech and the treatment of Isaac by the Hittites is a test, because he's told that he needs to live here, to sojourn here. But the people here are pushing him out. And everywhere he goes, it seems like it's wrong. I'm going to dig up another. No, you can't. You can't be here. Okay, I'll go somewhere else. No, you can't. That's our. Okay. And he just keeps moving until eventually he finds a spot. And then eventually Abimelech comes back and he says, okay, that's enough. We love you. We see that you are now the blessed one of God. And then he has a peaceful life.
Until the end of the chapter.
Well, yes, it doesn't last that long.
So Isaac is given these instructions, and then he immediately goes and he lies.
Just like his dad.
Good old dad. So he claims Rebecca is his sister out of fear. So we've talked about this a lot already, but the one question that I put is where Abimelech identifies that Rebecca is his wife. It's because he sees them laughing together. And so my question, is there a special kind of laughter between spouses? How is this word the identifier for Abimelech?
So the Hebrew word used here is metzahek, which oddly enough is the same word that's used for Ishmael when he's laughing at Isaac. So it's weird. It's a versatile word, and it can mean a lot of different things. It can mean to laugh or mock or even to play. The context is very important in interpreting what the word means. In the context of a man and a woman laughing, it's almost a euphemism, and it can be interpreted as basically playing flirtatiously. Different interpretations, like different translations of the Bible, will have it set differently. And like you can see this for yourself. If you go on something like Bible Gateway, just check a few different versions of the Bible. There are some pretty wide ranges. Some of them will say laughing. One of them talks about fondling.
It makes me think about, sometimes Cody and I will be like in a parking lot or grocery store or whatever, and I'll grab his butt, and it's just like a goofy, flirty thing that we do, but it's like quick. But Abimelech must have caught Rebecca grabbing Isaac's butt or something.
I think so. Going to real quick to Targum Onkelos, I know I talk about it all the time, but the way that Onkelos writes out this verse is, once after Isaac had been there a while, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked at the window and saw, and behold, Isaac was amusing himself with Rivkah, his wife. It's meant to be they're acting playfully with one another. They're being flirtatious in a way that no brother and sister ever would. And in many ways, it does seem innocent, but it's meant to reinforce, again, with the previous couple chapters, they love one another. Like, they are very much in love with one another. They enjoy each other's company. They're happy together. And yes, the fact that they lied is important to stress. But also another stressor is Abimelech sees just this one interaction. He's like, you two are in love. What are you talking about?
It took one look at them being their true selves, and he's, no, you're in love.
You guys are madly in love with one another. What are you two kids doing?
Also, like the fact that Isaac's name means laughter, and this is one of the very few chances where we actually see Isaac being the one who's laughing, and his laughter compared to his parents is much more innocent and like tender. I love that.
You would.
It's because I feel that way about you, sir. Okay.
Yeah. So after this, kind of rebukes Isaac for duping him in again, like his father did. But it's interesting how this pagan king knows the stamp of God. Like he sees it with Abraham, and had basically it's not a theophany, but an experience with God that most pagan kings you don't hear about having. And then he clearly knows here, like you brought up, like you are now the blessed of the Lord. He sees that has been transitioned from Abraham to Isaac. And like this idea, like a lot of people, when they talk about the indwelling of the Spirit, like that's a newer thing because of Christ, and like the indwelling of the Spirit is New Testament only, but the language you hear in the Old Testament is the Spirit rested upon them. And like you that here play out with this pagan king of he clearly knows that Isaac is now the chosen of God.
And it's also worth noting, first, there is some debate as to whether or not this is the same Abimelech. Abimelech may be a name, but it also may be a title, or it could be both. But from a lot of the Jewish tradition that I saw, it seems like generally they say that this is Abimelech's son who has the title of Abimelech. But even so, that makes it even more incredible that his son also knows God. I don't know that I can argue definitively one way or another. I'm fine with it being the same Abimelech, honestly. I don't know why it has to be a different one.
I thought it was I read it as the same because isn't the general of the army the same name for the general? And he talks, I also think there's a callback when they argue over land of it being
It wouldn't surprise me because they knew Melchizedek. Like Melchizedek was easily able to identify like holy ones of God, and Abraham walked with him and walked with Abimelech, and Abimelech and Abraham were friends. Like they had a relationship with each other and knew each other well. For Abimelech to call him on it, to me, it makes sense that it's the same guy, because first glance, and he's no.
So no, you're not pulling this on me a second time. Oh no.
Fool me once, fool me twice. Shame.
And you get no wells.
But setting that issue aside, and it really isn't that big of an issue, whether you think it's a title and it's his son or not. What's also very interesting to me is that you're starting to see some kind of conflict already emerging between Israel and the Philistines. Eventually, they become pretty fierce enemies and they're fighting all the time. But in this initial stage, the people that the Philistines that we know descend from are godly people, or at least some of them seem to be. Their leadership seems to be. And while we do see the beginnings of conflict where they're fighting over land and they say, no, you can't be with us, you're too strong, there is a reconciliation there, at least for a short period of time, and a recognition that the hand of God is on them. So it is unfortunate that they are fated to be enemies, but at least for this time, God is able to bring them together because someone is able to recognize that God is with someone.
So they get rich, just like Abraham.
But this wealth is not from Abimelech. Like he's not giving it to them.
No, let's read it. And Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him.
I think in many ways this chapter is showing what Abraham could have had if he had been spared the stupid decisions he made.
Just even looking at his relationship with Rebecca, Isaac's relationship with Rebecca, that like playful, fun, and Isaac prayed for his wife and she got pregnant. Like all of the blessings that Abraham longed for, and then he wept bitterly over after Sarah died. This is Isaac living out the cycle breaking to a certain extent.
It's also interesting, you know, how we stressed a lot of the faults both of Abraham, but also Sarah. You don't really see a lot of faults from Rebecca. You do in a sense, like in the next chapter, obviously, where she manipulates her husband to get something that she wants. But the thing that she wants is what God has promised. She's manipulating her husband to do the thing he knows he should do. And so she's effectively pushing him to do the right thing. Now, yeah, you could say she could have done it in an honest way. Yeah, probably. But it's also interesting that there was an intelligence to Sarah as well. There was a manipulativeness, but also it wasn't done in the right way. She's like, no, have my servant Hagar. We're going to take things into our own hands. We're going to produce an offspring. It can't be through me because I'm too old. Whereas Rebecca is, now God's told us something and you're not doing it. I love you, honey, but that's not right. So we're going to do it right.
Yeah, I think people forget that a lot, that God is the one who told Rebecca that Jacob was going to be the leader of the covenantal promise. Like, she gets this label of conniving and stealing away the blessing from Esau and her part in that. But this is also what God told her.
I think people get upset because the idea of a mother favoring a child, it makes us uncomfortable. Like, hearing that she loved Jacob and that her husband loved Esau, that makes people uncomfortable. Like, we have 3 kids. It makes me uncomfortable to say, I love this one more than the other one. I couldn't do that. It takes some boldness to do that. And it also probably takes having a kid with a pretty difficult personality to have that opinion. Like, you have to put yourself in their shoes. So I guess if maybe you have mommy or daddy issues, then it makes you more uncomfortable that they played favorites.
I think there are children who have special relationships with their parents. I would say that all of my brothers and sisters had different relationships with my parents and still do. And some of that comes from, like, my brother Jack. He was born with cerebral palsy, so he needed some very special attention when he was young. And so his relationship with my parents was different as a result of that. And also, there are stereotypes based on age. Like, the oldest tends to be the most responsible and self-reliant, and the youngest tends to be the most attention-hungry and tends to go into acting or politics.
Don't say that about Shiloh.
She will be the first woman president. But
no one can stop her now.
But, like, you shouldn't love any one of your children more. You should always be seeking the best for them. And I would argue Rebecca is seeking the best for Esau, because what Isaac is trying to give Esau, he should not get.
Yes, but we live in an era of participation trophies and equal rights. And so if you love one child above and beyond the other, then you're wrong. You're a bigot.
Parents, whether they admit it or not, do love children or a different child more.
When they're little, you have to love them uniquely because they're at different age ranges. Like, we have a 4-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 14-year-old. I can't give the 14-year-old the same kind of attention I give my 4-year-old because it would infantilize her and insult her and she would hate it. But at the same time, now that I'm an adult, the adult relationship that I have with my parents is different than my brother's. And I know that there's, like, different personality qualities that my parents like more in my brother than they like in me. I'm more of a free thinker. I go against the grain and against the flow a lot. I tend to argue more than everybody else. You can feel that tension of they like my brother more than they like me. Now, I know that they love me, and I know that my relationship with them is unique and special, and I wouldn't change it. I'm happy and secure in that relationship. But I can see where, and just like even friend to friend, you have a best friend and then you have a regular friend. Sometimes you just favor one over the others, and that's the way that your personality is. I don't know.
As far as loving, you love everyone. But I can't speak for my parents, but for my brothers and sisters, like I've said before, my brother Jack was the person I loved the most in this world. I love all of my siblings. I love both my brothers. I love all 3 of my sisters. But Jacob was the one I loved the most. And it's not that love is probably the wrong word. I was closest with him. He and I had a lot more affection, a lot more inside jokes. We understood each other a lot more. After he died, the whole family got a lot closer together, and now I'm a lot closer with all of my siblings, but especially my oldest brother. He and I didn't talk very much growing up at all. And part of that's because he was in the military. Part of it's because we're very different people. But now the relationship that I had with my brother Jacob is a lot closer to what I have with my brother Nathan. Like, no matter what, you can't have the exact same relationship with everyone. It's not the way it works. It's not the way that we're wired. Now, you can love everyone. And by love, I mean seek the best for each person. And I do believe that you guys both, you have children, you seek the best for each of your children no matter what. But that doesn't mean that your actual relationships with each one is exactly the same, and it shouldn't be.
But isn't that a great picture of how God loves us?
Oh, yes.
Like, when you have David, who was a man after God's own heart, and then you have Job, you have people that God handpicked over the centuries. And it's like there's millions and billions of people in the world, but there were certain ones that he had a closer relationship to. And as Christians, we have to be cool with that. Just like as relatives, we have to be comfortable having different, unique relationships because of closeness and preference and obedience and all of those things. It's a great picture of the way that God works with us and the way that we can interact with him. Not because we want to be his favorite, because we know he doesn't necessarily have a favorite. It's just he selects people to be closer to than others. And there are factors that go into that.
It's like last episode. Are you a David or a Jonathan? And no one's David. David is the only David. But you can be someone's Jonathan in their story. And Jonathan's not the guy who gets the spotlight of that story, but he has a massive impact on that story. The servant who goes and gets Rebecca. We don't know his name. And that seems to be the only real impact he has on the biblical story. And yet it's a profound one. And he could have been upset at that. Why am I not Abraham? You're not Abraham. But you can be the best version of yourself that you can be. And in so doing, you have a massive impact on God's kingdom. And you're right, Gina, we do have to be content with that. Not every vessel made by the potter is the same.
And not all of the vessels are intended for productive growth. Like, we know some things are designated for destruction. We're always going to have the poor. There's always going to be some sort of symbol of the layers of humanity. It's not about who's God's favorite or who's more blessed. This is not prosperity gospel. This is truly just the human condition in a fallen world.
And also, to be clear, you can change the type of vessel that you are. Not that you can by your own force of will, but there are people who change what they are. Like, David doesn't start out his story at the high point, and Saul starts his story out at the high point and ends at a low point. It does seem like our decisions do make an impact, or rather our hearts behind the decision make an impact. Man looks at the outward appearance, the Lord looks at the heart.
And then you dig wells.
Yep. Digging holes.
Digging up, boom.
Dig it up.
Shia LaBeouf's greatest work.
Aside from actual cannibal Shia LaBeouf.
Was that his work, though?
He shows up at the end, and it's all about him. So I'm going to say...
He is the inspiration.
He is the inspiration.
Shia, if you're listening, we would love to have you as a guest.
We'll be running for our lives from Shia LaBeouf.
With microphones. Yeah, Isaac and Abimelech make a covenant because of these wells, the well situation. And the thing that I really want to point out is verse 16, where Abimelech says to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we." So this stood out to me because it's like a parallel to the later experience of the Israelites in Egypt under Pharaoh, when they grow to become so numerous that Pharaoh's kind of like afraid of what they're going to become. So in Genesis 26, 12 through 14, it says, Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. Then in Exodus 1:7, it says, "But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." And then you see the fear of the power. So in Genesis 26:16, and Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we." In Exodus 1:9 through 10, it says, "And Pharaoh said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply." So in Isaac's case, Abimelech makes like a peace treaty, and he's doing it in a gentle manner, but then later on in the Exodus story, it's done very violently and like in an enslaving and not empowering way. And I see the connections here. And then in Genesis 26, verse 3, it's got God's promise for Isaac. And then in Exodus 3:12, it also promises that God will be with them. So like you have this sovereign rule from God and this multiplication from God. But in Isaac's case, I think because the story hasn't been fully fulfilled yet, like you see this sort of peaceful transition with this covenant, but you don't see that again in the future. It starts to fall apart for the Israelites and they fall under the rule as slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt. And I wonder if maybe God was warning Isaac away from Egypt because of this future. I don't know. Just something I saw.
No, that's one of the things that, like, these common themes that you see, like going to Egypt here, God clearly says is bad. And you see how the 12 the brothers of Jacob, and they force Joseph out, and he's exiled himself to Egypt. And now
he's sold to Egypt.
Yeah, so now he's there, and he is who the line is going to come through. Or he is the chosen one of God at that point. So they flock to Egypt, even though it seems they're not supposed to leave this land. And that ends up bad for them. They end up living there in abundance, but then over time eventually become enslaved. So I think God's sovereign rule, he'll get his plan and use the methods that are available. But I do think if they stayed there, if they didn't sell Joseph away, like there would have not been this enslavement of them. They would have stayed in the land that they were promised and taken it over in God's time.
This bounces back to verses 4 and 5, which is, "And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." It's not that God would have avoided sending Jesus if Abraham hadn't been obedient. It's just the covenant plays out in a much longer game, in a much different way, depending on the obedience of man. And when you have people like Esau, who we're going to talk about in a minute, who are not kingdom-minded and don't understand the spiritual burden of the covenant, then you get way off track really easily.
Yeah.
So I just thought that was really interesting.
I like that. I like that a lot. For me, in this whole line, like one of the things that stands out to me, and I suggest people heavily look at, is the covenantal meals all throughout Scripture. We have that chiasm again. So there's this covenantal meal selling the birthright. There's this covenantal meal with Abimelech for the peace treaty. And then there's another covenantal meal between Isaac and Jacob pretending to be Esau to get the blessing. So you have, just in this little short period, the covenantal meals, but we've already highlighted a bunch of them throughout Genesis already. You have the meeting of God with Abraham and the two other angels at Mamre. You have
Lot.
You have Lot. You have Melchizedek breaking bread and wine. And all of these connect to, in the sense of the covenants with God, you're communing with God at that point. There's this meal that symbolizes in the ancient Near East, like peace and promises. There was weight that was held to these meals, and it connects to hospitality, biblical hospitality a lot too, of what it meant. And that's why Abimelech here wants to have a covenant, and they have a meal. And anybody who breaks that, it is very taboo in ancient culture to like double cross the person you just had this covenantal meal with. They shared in the hospitality and all that. And later we see Judas doing exactly the opposite of that. He breaks bread with God. The idea of the Eucharist right there, present, he takes it, but then he betrays God. And this is something no culture would have done.
And it's really fascinating that you lay it all out like that, because we're told in the New Testament, whoever partakes of the Lord's Supper in an unworthy way is guilty of sinning against God. And it seems that there's a very long-standing tradition behind that. The idea that when Christ was breaking bread, he was effectively doing a covenantal meal with them. And not just with them, but us as Christians, every single time we take communion, we're partaking of the Lord's Supper. We are doing that covenantal meal with him. And we're supposed to have the same reverence for it now, acting as if we are having it with him, because where two or more are gathered together, there he is in our midst. He is here with us as we take communion, assuming you're not just there by yourself, and you shouldn't be. And I do think that a lot of the non-denominational evangelicals don't really get a good feel for that. It's been so long since I've seen communion done that felt like it was giving it that degree of respect and reverence. And this isn't something that's true amongst all Protestants. Lutherans give it a lot of respect. Anglicans give it a lot of respect. And as far as the mainline denominations, Catholics give it a lot of respect. And the Oriental Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox, they all give it a lot of respect. So this isn't a universal issue in the church. But I do find for the churches that I've been to, it really doesn't give it that weight.
Yeah, it's tough because if you look at scripture and ancient Near East culture just a little bit, like what is happening during communion is worship. And nobody in the average Protestant church views it that way, guaranteed. Like
something we do once a month, and that's about it, yeah.
Yeah, and you have the worship that you're just mocking and going through. You might be a little bit more introspective during that time, and you might thank God for his sacrifice, but this was a connection. Like you're literally sitting down with Jesus. You're literally communing with people. And that's why like hospitality in the Old Testament was such a big deal. And like even still today in Israel, culture is a huge deal to be hospitable and break bread with people, because it is a way of, one, humbling yourself and letting somebody you don't know into your home, but also what scripture teaches us is one of the acts of true worship.
And building on that, Paul even asks people not to come to communion hungry. Like back in the day, it was a proper meal. Nobody practices it that way, as far as I'm aware. Pretty much everybody has some version of you get a wafer and you get a little bit of wine and that's it. It's not really a meal at all, which isn't to say that it's a bad or a false communion. But the way that the first church practiced it, it was a proper meal. But Paul didn't want you to come there hungry and take advantage of the situation to get a free meal. He said, no, you don't come hungry. You come to have a feast with the Lord. The focus shouldn't be on your own hunger, but on actually having a meal with Christ himself. That communion with him.
And you see this idea set up for the new heavens and earth. Like, what do you think it means that God is preparing a table for you? What do you think that means? This is the idea, the communion with God, being in the presence with God, sharing in just the hospitality of God. Like that is what it is about. And I think we don't focus enough on that, even though it is all throughout scripture.
It's very nice to remember that today on Good Friday when we're recording, because it's the Easter season, and Judas doing what he did is impactful at this time of year. Like the spiteful, wretched way that he betrayed Christ before the incredible sacrifice that was made, it is unheard of. And culturally, having from the beginning of the world, like these covenantal meals, it's precious, and it's disappointing that Jesus was betrayed like that. And I'm grateful that he still died for us.
So building on that, it's strange. Jubilees has a bit of an odd take. Jubilees can occasionally give some really nice context to parts of the story, or even if I don't fully buy onto something, it'll interject ideas like Mastema showing up at the Agata. And that's okay. I could see that. There's some similarities between that and Job. But here, Jubilees chapter 24, verses 37 through 38. And Isaac knew that day that under constraint he had sworn to them to make peace with them. And Isaac on that day cursed the Philistines and said, Cursed be the Philistines unto the day of wrath and indignation from the midst of all nations. That's a weird take. For one, there's the feast, and it's the idea of the covenantal feast. Like, it seems like it's a happy occasion. Abimelech has come to Isaac and said, okay, I'm sorry. We haven't physically harmed you or anything. We don't want to physically harm you. We want there to be peace. That's great. So I think that this is actually kind of something done in retrospect, because Jubilees was written in the Second Temple period. It was a long time after any of this happened. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, they knew that eventually the Philistines become the enemy of Israel. And so I think they were trying to write that into the story. I don't think it needed to be there.
Agreed. No, this is definitely, you see this in Second Temple. Like, we talked about it with Esau and Edom a little bit. Like, you have this negative view on Esau, and that comes across for the person Esau that the Bible just doesn't elaborate on. But later, the Bible does elaborate on Edom and what the nation of Esau becomes as being bad, not the person Esau or Edom.
Yeah.
And I think it's similar here. You have Abimelech, who represents the Philistines, and what they later become to Israel, you have this bias against them.
You can also read about that in the book of Obadiah. That's one of the books in the Bible that like jumps way back, even though it's during the prophets. And I find it very interesting.
Oh, yeah, so building off of how odd this chapter is, just jumping in immediately after the Jacob and Esau situation with the birthright, immediately going into Isaac for a while. Now at the very end of this chapter, for some reason, we immediately go back to Esau. And guess what? He gets married.
Yay, congratulations. Except he marries two girls and they're Hittites.
Yep. And they were a source of grief for Isaac and Rebekah.
In my version, it's they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah.
I think that's actually a much better translation.
So looking back to the story of Abraham and how he sent his servant out with this covenantal promise to find a bride for his son Isaac, because it couldn't possibly be one of the locals. And Isaac is given this great promise from God in this chapter about how he is going to have this offspring that is numerous and they inherit the land and all of that great stuff. Esau turns around and he's, hey, I'm going to marry the locals. And I'm not just going to marry one that I love like you love your wife. I'm going to marry two of them. And we're going to make life crazy for you.
Once again, in Targum Onkelos for this verse, it says, they were rebellious of spirit too, or they were rebels and aggravators against the words of Yitzhak and Rivka. Basically, they were just two really nasty girls.
The in-law effect.
There's so much wrong with this.
I think, again, this is solidifying the covenantal line, because what does Jacob do? Like, what do we know Jacob does? He goes back to... There's something wrong with these Hittites. Like, they're just terrible people. Even though Abimelech here and the people of that region know of God, they are not of God. They are not his choice. And I think that's ultimately the bitterness for the parents here, is there's something off.
And I also think, once again, it's difficult to see this with the layout of the chapters and verses. But once again, Isaac's story is sandwiched between his children. And at the start of this, we were shown Esau giving up his birthright. And now, at the end of Isaac's story, after we're shown what a righteous man looks like and the pursuit of something that's holy and good and the obedience and faithfulness to God, we're now immediately seeing another reason for why Esau was not chosen. Because rather than doing what his father was shown to do, what was told to do, and the arduous process that he had to go through, and what Jacob is eventually going to go through himself to get a righteous woman. Instead, Esau takes the easy option. And that's what he always does. It's what he did with his birthright. And his beautiful birthright, like the greatest honor a human being could reasonably have. He gives that up for a bowl of soup, and rather than seeking a righteous woman, like his brother is eventually going to do, and his father did, and his grandfather did. No, he's just, okay, who are the hottest girls here? Or I'm going to take more than one, too.
Yeah, and this leads into what we were saying earlier of falling into the desires of the physical heart here. Like, You have Esau, who is just the poster child for pursuing natural desires. And he did it with just food for a birthright. He does it the easy way out. And what I can only view as a lustful way, marries two wives in one verse here.
Now, granted, Jacob does also eventually marry two wives. However,
but it wasn't by choice.
No.
It was deceptive.
He's literally tricked into it by Laban. By the way, trickiness seems to run in Rebekah's family. But yeah, Laban tricks him. And he can't really back out of the marriage, and he shouldn't at that point, because that would have left Leah high and dry, and that would have been very cruel and terrible to do to her too. But his contract was for Rachel. He loves Rachel, and so he pursues Rachel. And then eventually his two wives bring in their servants as surrogates when they can't have kids. And so that complicates things further. Again, it's a repeated theme in this section of the Old Testament. The idea of people trying to take things into their own hands and doing stupid things that negatively impact themselves and their children. But this is a decision that Esau makes for himself. He's not tricked into it.
It's almost like my brother stole my birthright. My mom loves my brother more than me. I'm a man of the field. I'm a hairy red dude. I love being outdoors. I'm just going to do my thing. And I'm super unconfident. So now I'm going to take two wives. And I don't even really love them, but I'm going to take them because they're beautiful and local. And I'm going to be the rebel. Tell me you're insecure without telling me you're insecure.
Isaac, and it seems like he almost likes the animalistic Esau. Like, he likes Isaac because he is a hunter, because he's the man's man almost, it seems. And
he's the Gaston.
Yeah.
He's a big hairy man. And every last inch of me's covered with hair.
He's especially good at expectorating.
Yeah, and really, in anyone else's story, he'd probably be the hero. He's the big, strong man. He's the conqueror. He's the mighty man.
It's almost like you hear the stories of the mega church pastor's daughter who turns 18 and smokes pot and gets arrested and joins a sorority and goes on Girls Gone Wild and all of that, even though she was raised knowing better and she understands the kingdom mindset. She rejects it because it's so ingrained in her family and she just can't live up to it. I wonder if that's Esau's conflict. I don't know.
I think he's a very emotional person. And I don't think he's an irredeemably terrible person. The way his story resolves with Jacob is actually fairly sweet and tender. But I think there's also a reason why Jacob doesn't stay with Esau. I think he recognizes that there are virtues in his brother, but there's a lot of evil. And there's a tendency to take the easiest way. A very emotional person that takes the easiest way is not the best person to be around. And so I do think that Jacob ultimately does love his brother, and Esau, for all his faults, does love Jacob. But unfortunately, that's not always enough.
No, that with Abraham and Lot, not identical stories, but Lot disappears after Sodom. And part of me thinks it's because Abraham knew that he was only saved because of Abraham. He had become ingrained with that culture and a part of that culture, and was not the people that are righteous and called and set apart should be hanging around. And I think anybody who has come to the faith as an adult kind of understands that mentality with past friends. You have to sever some friendships coming in with previous lifestyles that people don't understand, they don't support. I got to witness that with you and your family and your walk with God. If your friends just don't get it, they don't understand, they don't see it. And that's not all of them. Some of your friends you can lead to God and we'll get there, but sometimes it's just better to sever ties.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.